You've seen the videos. Hell, you've probably shared it. Some guy in his garage with a flathead screwdriver turns that one little screw on the side of a Rochester Quadrajet a quarter turn, and suddenly his engine comes alive. Comments going nuts, 100,000 views, everybody screaming that this is the secret that dealers never told you. Let me tell you exactly what those videos got wrong. That screw, the secondary air valve tension screw, does not add fuel. It does not unlock hidden horsepower. What it does is change the timing of when the secondary barrels crack open. That's it. And if you get that timing wrong, if you loosen it too far, you don't get more power. You get what the Quadra-Junk community has been calling the Quadra-Bog for 50 years. A stumble so bad it'll make you think your carburetor is garbage. And that's exactly how a $40 carburetor that fed everything from a Camaro Z28 to a Corvette Stingray to a Trans Am ended up with the worst nickname in American automotive history, the Quadra-Junk. And it's almost entirely user error. I'm going to prove that to you today, with data, with engineering history, and with the actual tuning methods that Rochester's engineers put into this thing. Because once you understand how this carburetor actually works, you're going to realize it's not a piece of junk. It's a mechanical computer, and most people have been too impatient to learn how to run it. The viral myth of the magic screw. Let's start with the screw, because that's what everybody wants to talk about. On the top of a Quadrajet, you'll see the secondary air valve, basically a flat plate that covers the two rear venturis. That plate is held shut under spring tension. The screw we're talking about adjusts how much tension that spring puts on the plate. Here's what loosening that spring actually does. It allows the secondary air valve to swing open sooner and more easily under high airflow demand. The engine sucks harder, the plate opens faster, the secondaries come in earlier in the RPM range. That is 100% of what that screw does. It does not change how much fuel the metering system delivers. It does not increase the carburetor's maximum CFM rating. It does not touch the primary circuit, the idle circuit, the power enrichment circuit, or anything else. So why does loosening it sometimes feel like more power? Because on a lot of engines that have been sitting, or that have been set up conservatively from the factory, the secondaries were opening too late. Moving that spring slightly earlier brings the rear barrels into play at a more useful point in the power band. That's a real effect, but it's a timing adjustment, not a volume adjustment. The bog, the part the viral videos skip. Here's where it goes wrong and why this matters. If you loosen that spring too far, and on a lot of engines, too far is less than a half turn, the secondary air valve opens before the engine has built enough vacuum to properly atomize and draw fuel through the secondary nozzles. You get a massive sudden slug of air with not enough fuel to match it. The air-fuel ratio goes dangerously lean for a fraction of a second. That is the Quadra-Bog. Not a design flaw, not a weak fuel pump, a mechanical inevitability when the airflow timing outruns the fueling system's ability to respond. Rochester engineers knew this. The spring tension was set at the factory based on the engine's actual airflow characteristics, cam profile, compression ratio, intake manifold design. When somebody on the internet tells you to do a quarter turn without knowing anything about your specific engine combination, they are guessing, and sometimes those guesses blow up on camera and they just don't post that footage. Stay with me, because in the next chapter, I'm going to show you why this carburetor earned the Quadra-Junk label in the first place, and I promise it has almost nothing to do with how it was designed.
The Quadra-Junk label, a user error data map. Where the bad reputation actually comes from. The Quadra-Junk reputation almost always comes down to two specific, fixable user errors. Number one, the fuel bowl well plugs. The Quadrajet uses epoxy-sealed plugs in the fuel bowl to cap off the manufacturing passages used to drill the main well passages and emulsion holes. Rochester used an epoxy that, frankly, does not hold up after 40 or 50 years of ethanol-blended fuel, heat cycling, and sitting dry over winter. When those plugs start to seep, and they will seep, fuel bypasses the metering system entirely and dumps raw into the intake. You get flooding, you get vapor lock, you get a rich stumble at idle that no amount of mixture screw adjustment will fix because the leak isn't in the idle circuit. The actual fix costs about $8. You re-drill the plugs, chase them with a tap, and install brass cup plugs with sealant. $8 in 2 hours. But nobody goes that far before calling it Quadra-Junk and bolting on a holly. Number 2, vacuum leaks at the base plate. The Quadra-Ject's throttle body is a die-cast aluminum piece mounted to an intake manifold that's often aluminum too. Both surfaces expand and contract with heat. The factory torque spec on the mounting bolts is between 48 and 72 inch-pounds, not foot-pounds, inch-pounds. That's barely more than finger-tight by feel. What does everybody do when a carb feels loose? They torque it down harder. And when you over-torque an aluminum base plate against an aluminum intake, you warp it. You create a vacuum leak right at the base that makes the idle circuit completely non-functional. The engine runs lean and rough, and no amount of idle mixture adjustment does anything because the bleed air is bypassing the idle circuit entirely. Again, not a design flaw, a user error with a specific, fixable cause. Here's the bottom line on the Quadra-Junk reputation. Rochester built a carburetor that was highly engineered, with tight tolerances, designed to be set up once and left alone. When you give that carburetor to people who are used to swapping jets and turning screws on a holly until something works, you get frustration. That frustration has a name, and it's wrong. Now we're going to get into why this carburetor is actually smarter than most of the people criticizing it, and why variable CFM is the phrase that changes everything. The true secret: variable CFM and the mechanical computer. The concept nobody explains correctly. A fixed Venturi carb forces 750 CFM into the engine, whether it wants it or not. The Quadrajet doesn't work that way. It uses a demand-based metering system. Small 1.093-inch primaries for crisp street manners and massive rear venturis that only open when the engine actually asks for them. That's not an accident. That's the design philosophy. The real secondary secret, and it's not the spring. Now here's where almost every Q-Jet video gets it wrong, including the ones that know better than to mess with the spring. The secondary circuit on a Q-Jet doesn't use fixed jets. It uses tapered metering rods that hang down into the secondary wells. The taper on those rods, and more importantly, how far they're sitting down into the well, controls the secondary fuel delivery. That height is set by the secondary metering hanger. The hanger is a stamped metal piece with specific bend points. Change the hanger, you change the fuel delivery curve in the secondaries across the entire RPM range, not just peak flow, the whole curve. And the rod tips themselves come in multiple diameters. A thicker tip in the metering position means less fuel flows around it. A thinner tip means more fuel. Rochester offered dozens of combinations of hanger height and metering rod diameter for different engine applications. This is the tuning matrix that professional Q-Jet builders work with, and this is the adjustment that actually makes a difference in how the engine makes power. The spring gets you into the ballpark, the rods and hanger get you dialed in. Coming up next, not all Quadrajets are the same, and the one you want for a performance build might be hiding in a 1974 station wagon. The 800 CFM casting discovery. They're not all the same carb. Here's something a lot of people don't know, and it matters if you're building anything with serious RPM potential. Starting in 1971, Rochester introduced what builders called the large-bore Quadrajet. The change was in the primary venturis, bumped from the standard 1.093-inch diameter up to 1 7/32 inches, which works